Thank you very much. What I'm going to try to do is compress about 30 years of experience into 30 minutes. So there may not be a lot of detail in my talk, but perhaps we can go into that as we get into the questions. So this is the culprit, and no. All right, this is the culprit. Among the cereal aphids, it's fairly easy to distinguish. It has greatly reduced cornicles and then an additional process at the back. And none of the other cereal aphids look different from that. In terms of history, it's native to the Trans-Caucasus region, so the mountain chain that goes up sort of through Central Asia. It was first reported from Russia in the early 1900s, and that's where its name comes from. It was reported attacking wheat. And then sometime later on, probably in the 50s, it started to expand its range and showed up in South Africa in the 1970s and has become a fairly persistent problem for them, continues to be a problem for them. Then it was found in Mexico in 1978 and fairly quickly moved, that was around Mexico City, moved up into the US in 1986. And from when we found it in Colorado in 1986, it moved all the way across the western US into the Pacific Northwest, a distance of about 1,500 miles in less than 2 years. So it is capable of moving quite rapidly. Then it was found in southern South America in the early 90s. It also during that time it expanded its range in Europe and Africa, and finally showed up in Australia this past year. And then Australia is the last major wheat producing region of the world that had not been invaded by Russian wheat aphids. So it's a highly invasive problem. This is the sort of damage we saw when it first showed up. And I will tell you that by our experience, that if you can see Russian wheat aphid problems from your pickup window, you've waited too long. Within these circles of damage, you will find stunted, discolored plants. And if you look closely at those plants, you'll see that the leaves are tightly rolled. The aphid prevents the leaves from unrolling, which forms a tube that shelters them from weather, natural enemies, and insecticides. Within those rolled leaves, you will find the aphid. There are two main forms of the aphid. This is the winged form, primarily a dispersal form. She does feed a bit when she finds a new plant, but they either move short distances within a field or larger distances depending on the condition of the crop. And then the wingless females are just for reproduction and feeding. And I will tell you that aphids have a fairly unique biology. These are all females. We've only have concrete evidence of males in North America one time. And these females are born pregnant, and the embryos within them are also contain embryos. So each individual is 3 generations, and that quickly makes them very able to reproduce very rapidly. And for Colorado, we've had an inordinate amount of the damage that's been experienced in the U.S. We've treated over 2 million hectares with insecticides. This is 30% of the U.S. total, even though we only grow about 5% of the country's winter wheat. And the impact of that was about $215 million over, mostly over the first 15 years of the problem. And that amount is insecticide costs plus yield losses, but we didn't use any economic multipliers. So the next thing I wanted to do is talk a little bit about sort of Russian wheat aphid field biology in my corner of the world, kind of how it operates there and give you a feel for what we see and what you might see based on your conditions. So, Russian wheat aphid is primarily a problem in the Great Plains, and in the western part of the Great Plains, we have and starting in the southern plains and going north. And sort of the way their field biology works is they spend most of the year on winter wheat. And so for us, that's approximately 9 months of the year. And their challenge is to get from the first winter wheat crop to the next one. And in the southern plains, they have two options. One is to go to cool season grasses, but if they do that, that leaves them with a gap. And so the other way for them to get to the second crop is to go through volunteer wheat. And so in the southern plains, they can go this way, but if they do, they have to go back to volunteer wheat and get on to the next crop. As you progress north, the summers become shorter and cooler, and so cool season grasses, a variety of non-cultivated grass species, become much more important because they cover this gap between the two wheat crops. And so in the central and northern plains, this is much more the scenario that we see. And so we kind of, our aphids move from winter wheat, cool season grasses, and back to winter wheat. And the weather conditions during this period, while they're on the cool season grasses, has a great influence on, I don't know how I did that, great influence on their year-round success. We've done a variety of grass surveys to get a better feel for which grasses they occur on and how well they do on those. This is just one of them, and in this case we surveyed 60 species of grasses, and some of those that were shown to be effective hosts include Canada wild rye, crested wheatgrass, foxtail barley, pubescent wheatgrass, and volunteer wheat. Always shows up as an important part of getting through the period between the two crops. Just as an aside, I will say that under our conditions, the Russian wheat aphid will follow those grasses all the way up to the Continental Divide, so well over 10,000 feet. We find them on grasses throughout the summer, and that may well play an important part of their field biology. But if you look at the infested parts of North America, this is sort of the epicenter of it, and which is eastern Colorado up into Nebraska and the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles. This epicenter is defined by two things. One is the availability of oversummering hosts, and the other is relatively mild overwintering conditions. And based on that, the most favorable conditions for Russian wheat aphid are found in southeastern Colorado, and that's been borne out year after year as we look at infestations. And what I wanted to do next is just to give you a little bit more detail on what the climate is like. So right at this point, there's a city there called Lamar, and Lamar temperatures, this is my interpretation of Celsius, and so our average temperatures will go below zero, and at times get into the mid-20s, close to 30, and then back down. And this aphid is remarkably cold tolerant. That's probably not of real significance for you, and it's probably less heat tolerant than some of the other cereal aphids. It's also a dry season, low rainfall aphid. This is monthly precipitation totals for the aphid. And in eastern Colorado, we grow our wheat with roughly 250 to 500 millimeters of rain a year. So it is a dryland wheat production. So that's sort of the characteristics of our that epicenter where the aphid does best. It can get fairly hot. It can get somewhat cold, quite a bit colder than here, and low amounts of precipitation. We have followed aphid populations over the years using modified Rothamsted suction traps, and these are long-term average captures, and you can see that early, the first 10 or 15 years, we had significant numbers of aphids flying every year. This particular peak is associated with the treatment of roughly 500,000 hectares. This is our last big outbreak, was in 2009, and in that case we treated about 200,000 hectares. But since then, with one or two exceptions, we have mostly settled into a pattern where the aphid is really a much more sporadic problem than it was during these early years. And this is not atypical of invading insects. We have looked some at biological control. We've focused on generalist predators. I won't go into the reason for that, but we have a fairly diverse fauna of ground beetles, as well as spiders associated with our wheat cropping systems. And then in other biological control studies, we have collected a number of other species, and none of them are what I would call surprising. So these are the usual suspects that you would find associated with cereal aphids throughout the Great Plains. So our biological control participants are not nothing out of the ordinary. When we, the first time we tried to measure the influence of biological control on Russian wheat aphid abundance, we did that in the mid-90s. And in that particular case, we found very little effect from biological control. And for reasons that I'm really not clear on, we decided to repeat those observations, and the picture had changed quite a bit. In almost every time we make a comparison, we see significant reductions in Russian wheat aphid due to biological control activity, and that is due to the levels of reduction that we see are in the 70 to 80% range at times. So that's quite a significant effect, and I think it's becoming sort of the driving factor in Russian wheat aphid abundance in eastern Colorado. We have also looked at cultural practices, modifying the way we grow crops to influence pests. We have been able to show that diversified cropping systems do have an impact on Russian wheat aphid, primarily through enhancement of biological control. I don't think that's an issue for you. It sounds like your cropping systems are much more diverse than ours anyway. Control of volunteer is a key step, no question about that. The question often comes up when I make this statement: what about all of those cool season grasses? And you might want to think about it, but logistically it would be impossible. The cool season grasses are everywhere. In terms of planting dates, it's a little more complicated than this, but generally speaking, we recommend delayed seeding of winter crops and early seeding of spring grains. And I won't go into the reasons for this, but that's a fairly effective rule of thumb. Clean seed, actually anything that you can do to promote good crop health and vigor will help with Russian wheat aphid. And in many cases, we see the crop sort of outgrow the aphid. And so cultural practices that enhanced crop growth will help with that phenomenon quite a bit. We have also worked quite a bit with plant resistance, and this is a picture of what plant resistance to Russian wheat aphid looks like. These are sister lines of winter wheat, and they've both been infested with equal numbers of Russian wheat aphid, and this plant will yield about 50% of what this plant will yield. And the only significant difference between these two plants is the presence of a gene called DN4. We have done a lot of variety development to incorporate DN4 into our varieties, as well as look for additional sources of resistance to Russian wheat aphid. We do that all with sort of large-scale phenotyping in the greenhouse based on seedling response to the aphid. We have produced a number of varieties containing DN4 over the years, a total of 10 now, and at one time those varieties represented approximately 40% of the acreage in Colorado, so it was a very successful approach for a long time. And I won't show you the data, but we have data that will show you that if you planted one of these varieties, you would not need an insecticide. So it's quite effective resistance. Well, I take it back. I thought I had taken this slide out, but this shows two sets of sister lines, either with DN4 or without. And these numbers here show the relationship between the aphid and yield. So the closer you get to zero, the less effect the aphid is having on yield. And in every comparison at several sites, the cultivar without DN4 is much more affected by the aphids. And again, that translates to not needing to use an insecticide. But we learned our integrated pest management lesson one more time, and that is if you rely on a single control approach, the pest will figure some way around it. So after 5 or 6 years of growing these resistant varieties extensively, we started to get reports of susceptible reactions in resistant varieties. One possibility for that is that there was a problem with seed source, but we went and got aphids from the area where these things have been reported and grew up resistant plants and put our greenhouse aphids on the plant and then these field collected aphids and got a susceptible response on a resistant plant with the field collected aphids, but not with the greenhouse aphids. So that was our evidence for a biotype, which is a pest that has evolved or has overcome the resistance that has been deployed. And we have now described 8 distinct biotypes. And I will tell you that there are many more biotypes than just these 8. I have a colleague in Oklahoma who has about 60 different biotypes in captivity, but he just doesn't have the time to describe them all. But the key one for us is what we call Russian wheat aphid 2. This is the original one, and this one has completely displaced one and really is the only significant one that we see anymore. And it's kind of sort of a scientific point, but it does seem to have additional traits beyond its ability to overcome resistance. We've been able to show that it's more cold hardy and has some other features that make it more competitive in our production systems. Okay, that's resistant varieties. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about yield losses. As with any pest-plant interaction. The losses are variable, but there are several pretty good studies that have reached the conclusion that what we see is roughly a 0.5% yield loss per percentage infested tillers. And that's based on studies from South Africa, several places in the US, and conducted by several different research groups. So I think this is a pretty good number. In barley, it's quite a bit higher. In some of our studies with barley, we've been able to cause yield losses of 90% or better. So it does much better and causes more damage to barley than it does to winter wheat. There are also quality losses. In wheat, this would be primarily expressed in test weight, but in barley, there are also effects on the malting enzymes that have been reported. I wanted to just mention crop growth stages and when to treat. This is an older threshold, but the point to make here is that the period between regrowth, remember this is winter wheat, so this would be approximately the tiller stage through early boot. This is the most susceptible time to Russian wheat aphid. And another way of putting that is that this is the period when you get the most response to insecticide control. Before that and after that, you will get less benefit from treatment. Now, based on that 0.5% yield loss business, we've been able to develop a dynamic threshold that allows you to take into account control costs and then crop value, which is a combination of expected yield and market value, and this is expressed in percent infested tillers. We also have some sampling programs that go with that, binomial sequential sampling schemes that can be used. But anyway, this is roughly the threshold that we use. Okay, so now that we have a threshold, we have also spent some time on chemical control, and this is my attempt to put this in Australian. So these are insecticide common names and either grams active ingredient per hectare or volume of product per hectare. And the way I look at chemical control is good control is reducing aphid abundance by 90% or more for 3 weeks. And I don't really see treatments that do much better than that. So this, the way this table is set up is the total number of tests that we have had or conducted, and then out of those tests, how many achieved this level of control that I consider to be good. And based on this standard, chlorpyrifos has been by far our most consistent treatment for reducing aphids. And I understand that this will be, your results will likely be different, and also you have access to different insecticides than we have. For example, Perimicarb is not labeled in the United States on small grains of any sort. So I'm trying to think if there are any others that we've looked at on a more limited basis, but this is pretty much the take-home. Chlorpyrifos is the most effective among the pyrethroids. Lambda cyhalothrin has been more or less the most consistent. And we also use some dimethoate. Dimethoate has issues primarily with low temperatures, so that takes it out of the picture to some extent. We have been looking for replacements for chlorpyrifos. It's on the regulatory block. and it's also not labeled in barley. So we need to find alternatives for the day that it might lose its registration, or if you needed to treat in barley. And the most likely replacement candidate is a mix of lambda-cyhalothrin plus thiamethoxam. And in the several studies we've done, plus a few more than this, we have found that this is equally effective. In spring grains, I don't have a lot of data on spring grains, but certainly my practical experience, and we use seed treatments a lot in research situations, the neonicotinoids are quite effective in spring grains and should be able to provide fairly close to season-long control. Our problem with winter wheat is, you would be applying a treated seed or planting a treated seed in September or maybe October at the latest, and expect it to provide control through the following May. And that's just not going to happen under our conditions. So for winter grains, it's really not a good option. So where are we with Russian wheat aphid? I think we've entered a period where the aphid is kept at sort of a sporadic pest status. And the reason it's kept at that pest status is that due to good cultural practices and naturally occurring biological control. And our growers are well experienced with Russian wheat aphid, and if they start to get a problem, or part of the state starts to have issues, then they know how to scout for it, and they will back up biological control and cultural practices with scouting results. And the last comment I wanted to make is that Russian wheat aphid was a severe problem for us, and we have eventually, or maybe better put, it has eventually learned to live with us. But I will tell you that it could be worse. We are now dealing with an insect pest that is much more problematic than Russian wheat aphid. This is an insect called wheat stem sawfly. This is undamaged wheat, and all this wheat lying on the ground is due to damage from this wheat stem sawfly. And it makes Russian wheat aphid look like a wimp, let me tell you. So with that, I will finish.
Thank you. 30 years of research, 30 minutes. I got more than 1 minute for 1 year, I hope. Okay, I'll try to keep it short anyway. What has happened here this year with Russian wheat aphids? The bomb struck, finally, after basically 30 years of fearing that the aphid would come in. Nothing happened, and now all of a sudden it's there. And it was there in a quite surprising way, because we did not find it very early, like in some of the states of the United States where they found it just locally. After 1 year, we already know that it is basically all over South Australia, New South Wales, parts of Victoria. Certainly not the end. Tasmania has been joining the crew just a few weeks ago, and we presume that it will go on. The only area that so far has no Russian wheat aphid, lucky Western Australia. And my guess is that New Zealand will actually be infested quite easily, because the aphids can probably be blown over by the wind. That is probably the main way in which these aphids will colonize, the prevailing wind, and that's why it looks as if they came in somewhere around Adelaide. Not sure where, not sure when, and they've been spreading probably already for a couple of years, because an outbreak of this size cannot just happen in 1 year. It's called the Russian wheat aphid, which is quite funny because, well, actually it's not from Russia. It's came out originally from the Caucasus, and it was described in Russia as a pest on wheats, on cereals for the first time. We don't know where it came from here. There's a lot of work being done using genetic studies. We've been doing a lot of biotyping. It's still being analyzed, so I'm not sure. It seems as if we have something which is close to the original American biotype that Frank talked about, which is Russian wheat aphid 1, RWA1, which is in fact quite good news. I should probably say it's great news, because that means that all the work that the Americans have already done in trying to find resistance genes and getting them into cereal lines, we can use that. We can probably quite easily start to breed resistance into our Australian wheats. Wheat is also wrong. It does attack wheat, but it actually prefers barley, then durum wheat, and then the other cereals. And that's what we've seen a little bit this year. What Frank also mentioned already is that barley seems to be often quite heavily attacked. Durum wheat, which is not a very common crop in Australia, but we've seen some really big attacks there. Wheat a little less, and then in the other crops, it seems not to have been a problem at all. It is an aphid, so I'm not going to contest the classification of an aphid. The actual scientific name means it's a long and very noxious aphid. I think that's a better description than Russian wheat aphid. Don't blame the Russians. How noxious is it in Australia? We don't know. Frank presented some details on intervention thresholds. We are in a very different situation. We've had very early attacks in autumn, and that's not what they see in the Americas. So at the moment, we're still not sure where we actually are with intervention thresholds. What happened? Well, basically, when the aphid was discovered, everybody was, well, let's face it, a bit panicking, because new pest, potentially high impact on yield, not sure how quickly it would build up. So in the end, many farmers decided to spray insecticide to solve the problem. What we saw actually is that it often occurred in high populations in early sown crops, and we think now that it was actually a green breach effect. So in these early sown paddocks, direct drilling, volunteer cereals already growing there, probably the aphid was already there, and we just presented him with some nice young green shoots, and he was happy to go there. She was happy to go there. They're all females, sorry for that. And in later sown paddocks, we haven't seen the same amount of aphids. We've seen aphids along the borders, so they come in from volunteer grasses growing on the edges, but we haven't seen these paddock-wide infestations, or at least not often. We couldn't spray in the beginning because we didn't know what pesticides would be efficient. We've done some emergency trials that gave finally the emergency permits for chlorpyrifos and pyrimicarb. There's now much more work being done, which will be presented right after me, so I'm not going to talk about all that today. What happened to the actual aphid dynamics? We were expecting, well, maybe a slowing down over cold winter periods, and then in spring they would build up and attack the crop and do a lot of damage, and yeah, well, basically they disappeared. In most paddocks, they dropped. After beginning of October, it was difficult to find them. That's nice. But what did actually happen? Well, we had a quite unusual winter. Even I, as a European, found that it was cold and wet in Australia, and you probably had the same impression. It was very wet. The aphids were actually rained off the plants by the impact of the rain droplets, and if that was not enough, there was also a fungus coming in, killing the aphids, an entomopathogenic fungi. Sorry for the difficult word, but it's quite efficient. It basically killed the Russian wheat aphid. It basically killed most aphids that were present on the wheat plants, corn aphids, oat aphids, etc. also went down, and we had difficulties finding them. These are 12 different paddocks in 3 different regions, the mid-north, the southeast, the Mallee, and Victoria, all had basically the same observation. The aphids disappeared. Nature did the job for us. Good. Not sure that's going to happen every year, but this year we dodged the bullet. The aphid were controlled by the fungi. The plants recovered very well. They just grew through it, so that was no problem anymore. We had no spring buildup of the aphids. In our paddocks, in our 12 paddocks, we could not find a significant yield loss. So basically, most of the economic loss was pesticide use, which is unfortunate because maybe now that we are living a bit later, we are sure that it was probably not even necessary in many cases, but I can understand it for a farmer with the uncertainty that he would spray an insecticide just to be sure that his crop would not be destroyed. What is interesting is these data, which we got from a couple of suction traps, not the same traps as Frank showed, but we have smaller suction traps that are running. We've got only two, one in balaclava, one in Kapunda, who has been running. And what you can actually see is that the mobility of the aphid, so the aphids flying, wasn't there. Well, just one little capture here, beginning of May, actually 1 week before the actual infestation in the paddock in Tarlee was discovered. But all over winter, we didn't see any aphid mobility, and aphids became mobile, started flying again, only in the warmer spring days. So yeah, all over winter, the problem wasn't really there. The aphids are still there. The aphids are flying around now that the weather is a bit warmer. Natural enemies can do a job. Frank said it already. What we've seen is a natural enemy, but not of the kind that you normally see. So this entomopathogenic fungi that really work nicely. We've also seen quite a few of parasitic wasps, minute little wasps that lay their eggs in the aphids, and the aphids will transform into what we call mummies, and then there will be a wasp coming out. So that worked quite well. We've got an honest student, Tom Heddle, who's been working on that, and he showed that there's quite a few species that you can identify, and the most important seems to be Diotrella rapey, which is the same species that also does quite a good job in the United States. So I think there's hope that natural enemies will contribute significantly to the regulation of the Russian wheat aphid, and let's hope that we don't have to wait as long as the Americans had to wait for an efficient control by natural enemies. What's going to happen? Well, I don't know. I can't predict the future, but this year is a bit of a weird summer. We've had rain regularly, so we have very nice green paddock. This is a paddock a week ago, basically, in Walker Flat, and it's even denser than if it would have been sown by the grower in autumn. This has aphids in it, and potentially, if you would sow in a paddock like this, there would be a green bridge effect, so that really you should avoid. Is there a big risk of grasses growing along the edge? We don't know. It could be that they're actually coming from much farther away. Maybe the Adelaide Hills, where there's always green paddocks with grasses in them, will be a source for aphid migration. It's all uncertainty. We still need to do a lot more observations to have some good data on that. We even don't know on which grasses the aphid is actually living, and that's a project that is running at the moment. In the future, resistance will be brought into commercial cereal varieties. We've been doing a bit of screening. At the moment, it's obvious that there's not much resistance in the Australian varieties, simply because they were never developed for resistance against this aphid, so that's not very surprising. But I think the breeders will be very quickly to jump on this project, and like I said, there's good resistance, so they should be able to develop resistant varieties quite quickly. Resistance can be overcome, as Frank already said. Let's hope that with an intelligent approach, we could maybe postpone that issue for more than just a couple of years and grow cereals without the need for insecticides to control Russian wheat aphids. Take-home message, well, there's a lot of missing data. We don't have a good idea about yield influence. We do have insecticides available at the moment. There will be some new insecticides registered, I presume. The resistance breeding will be the solution longer term. Just for this autumn, when you're going out to sow your paddocks, be aware that this green bridge effect seems to be a real risk. So don't just sow directly in a dirty paddock. You probably should suppress your weeds before you actually go in sowing. Thank you very much.
Before I begin, I'd just like to thank the AgXtra team in South Australia for conducting the trials. I'm just the face here to tell you about some of the results, but it really was a hard effort to get these trials up and going given the short time frame that we had, so I'd just like to thank the team. Also those at Practo in Victoria as well who conducted the Victorian trials. So today I'd just like to go through a little bit of the chemical control of Russian wheat aphid. I'll just be discussing a little bit about the methodology of what we did, where we undertook the trials, some of the challenges with dealing with Russian wheat aphid because they do act very differently than the aphids that we are used to, and some of the key results of our findings. Oops. technology. I'm old. So, as Craig alluded to, the GRDC commissioned a series of trials to look at currently registered insecticides that we are using for other aphids. There was an emergency use permit issued for chlorpyrifos and perimicard, but we also wanted to investigate if other insecticides that were being used would show some control for Russian wheat aphid. So there was a series of 5 trials looking at the comparison of single dose rates of insecticides, a number of SP insecticides and some dose rates, the effective temperature at application, because as we know that perimicard can have variable results when used at cool temperatures, the effective spray volume and quality, and the influence if we add adjuvants to those insecticides. So these 5 trial series, if you like, were conducted in South Australia and Victoria. We had 9 trials in South Australia and 7 in Victoria. So as I alluded to, the sites were selected in South Australia and Victoria based on a threshold of 10 aphids per tiller. So we were running around the countryside like headless chooks trying to find these aphids. Unbeknown to us, the rain was washing them away. But we did find the sites. Murray Bridge, Udunda, Tarlee, and the other one was Truro. And then in Victoria it was Lara and Patchewallick. So the project commenced in August 2016, and most of the sprays were applied in September and October. So given that the spray timing then, it wasn't early season sprays, we're looking at spring applications. The growth stage at the timing of spraying ranged from around the growth stage 24 of around 3 tillers in Victoria to the end of flowering. And in South Australia, we began spraying at around growth stage 42, early booting, to around flowering time. And the trials were conducted on either wheat or barley, which was an interesting fact I saw in the previous presentation, that they do favour barley, and we were finding a lot of infestation on barley when we were looking. So the trials were set up as a randomised block design, and I just put this slide up to show the distribution within a paddock. The colours indicate the hotspots, if you like, where red is hot in the paddock and the blue is light. So we had to make sure that the trials that we were selecting weren't just in hotspots of the paddock, but they were uniform in distribution. So our plot size was 10 by 10 metres, and the number on this slide here shows that the number is indicative of the treatment. So for example, this particular trial had 12 treatments, and as we can see here, if I get this pointer to work, or maybe I'll just use this. We've got a hotspot at treatment 3, but it's also in the range up the top here. Middle here is low and lower still. So we weren't just putting that treatment on a hotspot, if you like. So it was no significant difference between the treatments to begin with. So all trials had 1 spray application, and then the aphids were counted after the initial count, 7, 14 and 21 days, or around those timings because of the rain. There were a few challenges when dealing with Russian wheat aphid, and as we heard, the Russian wheat aphid stops the leaves from unrolling, whereas before it was perceived that they actually roll the leaf. It's actually, as the plant grows, they stop the leaf from unrolling. So to count these, individual leaves then had to be unrolled if they were inside to find the aphid. It wasn't just a matter of just looking on the outside of the leaves, there was a lot of work involved. We saw the aphids were on the lower leaves, and then once they sucked the life out of those, they moved up the plant, and we were able to see them then onto the head, which is something that in USA they don't see that regularly, I believe, Frank. So as we are aware, we had above average rainfall, which washed aphids off the crop. And we would find a site and then we'd go to spray and then realise, well, the aphids are gone, so we have to find another site. So I can appreciate the challenges involved with trying to set up these trials. So we had a natural decline in population due to rainfall. So we searched and we found the aphids, and there's the typical symptoms that you see, the striping caused by the feeding and the toxin released by the aphid while they're feeding, and some pictures there of them on the leaves, on the heads as well. So in Victoria, the crops were younger when they started the trials, so symptoms disappeared as they grew out, whereas what we were finding in South Australia, we had those symptoms and then symptoms persist. So you can't rely on monitoring of symptoms to know if the aphids were actually there. For the first trial at Balaclava, we tested 9 products, And the trial was sprayed at growth stage 61 at 21 degrees. So you'd think that the conditions were favourable for efficacy of Perimecarb. The results here are given as a square root mean of the aphid number of the 3 timings, the 7, the 14 and the 21 days. And you can see here that Perimecarb wasn't able to work as effectively as Lawsban. Just like to point out as well that we've got the initial count here. Oops, sorry, that one. The initial count there, you can see in the purple on the side that the untreated, even though it didn't have any chemicals on there, there was that natural decline, and that was due to rainfall. The same trial was then repeated on barley at Murray Bridge, and we can see we get some very different results. So the results that I'm showing today are very site-specific, but what we need to do is pull together all the data that we've got in South Australia and Victoria to make our final recommendations. But again, in this trial, we see that chlorpyrifos performed better than Perimecarb. There was a trend across all trials that the growth stage influenced the level of control, and in later crops infested with Russian wheat aphid, the leaves did remain rolled up, so they were protected from the sprays. In younger crops, however, the Russian wheat aphid were more exposed, and as Frank alluded to, that timing of spraying is very important so that that contact of the spray can control the insect. The crops responded better obviously to chemicals when they're sprayed early. We found that the efficacy of Perimecarb was in particular influenced by weather conditions and the crop stage of growth. We also did some, which I won't show today due to time constrictions, but we did some assessments of dose rates, and there was little significance between the products when used at the rates, but in general there was a trend that the higher rate gave more effective control. At Murray Bridge, we conducted the trial to look at the influence when adjuvants were added. More work obviously has to be done in this area, as we only selected a few adjuvants to try. The untreated plants had a high level of aphids, as you can see here, the purple bar, and all insecticides reduced incidence. But when we put the adjuvant in, we saw that increased level of efficacy of the chemical. As I alluded to, that Perimecarb can show variable results between the trials, and we can see here, as in the other trials, Lawsban worked quite well, but in this particular trial, the Perimecarb gave excellent results compared to the untreated control. So the take-home message today for you all is that rainfall had a significant effect in reducing aphid numbers, but we know this year was very unusual and we can't rely on rainfall. The chlorpyrifos was the most effective insecticide for control of Russian wheat aphid, and Perimecarb did show was an effective option as a soft option for beneficials, but the control was more variable between the trials. The SP performance was dependent upon the product, and as I showed in the earlier slide, that the Cobalt Advance appeared to provide some good control. The addition of adjuvants did improve the efficacy of chlorpyrifos, although more work is needed in this area as we restricted with the amount of number of adjuvants that we looked at. And spray application is important. I haven't alluded that today, but what we did find from spraying from 60, 80, 100 and 120 litres per hectare, we showed that 100 litres per hectare was more effective compared to the 60 litres of hectares. And finally, I'd just like to thank the excellent staff at AgXtra, particularly Steph Lunn and Georgia McGurrian, our entomology gurus, the staff at Paracto in Victoria, our collaborative growers for allowing us to be on their trial sites, GRDC for their input, the agronomists to help us find the sites, Greg and Michael Nash at the SARDI entomology unit for their advice, and the statisticians Sabella, Beverly and Alina. So thanks for your time.